Welcome to Sci-Fi Alien, where the cosmos comes alive with mind-bending stories of intergalactic warfare and unimaginable discoveries. Imagine a universe where humanity faces its greatest threat yet, an alien empire declaring war, only for humans to laugh in the face of extinction. Can the Kian Empire overcome the humans' unexpected power, or is humanity on the brink of rewriting history? Stay with us to find out. The peace humanity had enjoyed for 1,000 years was never meant to last. When the Kian Empire, an ancient and mighty alien species, first encountered Earth, it had been a brief, condescending glance. Humans were nothing more than a primitive species, a fleeting anomaly in a vast, uncaring universe. The Kian, having conquered 12 galaxies, dismissed Earth's primitive inhabitants with a single wave of their hand. They established a peace treaty, one that bound them to leave humanity alone, to let them grow and evolve without interference. It was a peace born from arrogance, not goodwill. They believed the humans would stagnate, remain insignificant in the grand scheme of the cosmos. But 1,000 years passed, and humanity did more than survive. They thrived. In that time, Earth had seen unimaginable advancements in technology, in social structures, in the very way they viewed the universe. They had mastered space travel, created artificial intelligence, and even harnessed the very fabric of space-time itself. What once was a barren planet on the edge of the cosmos was now a thriving hub of innovation, technology, and unyielding human spirit. The Kian Empire, however, had remained stagnant, consumed by their endless conquests. The peace treaty had allowed humanity to rise without interference, but the Kian had failed to realize that they weren't the only ones evolving. The Kian Empire's soldiers still relied on brute force, their weapons unchanged for millennia, while humans had learned the art of adaptation, of pushing boundaries, of thriving in the face of adversity. It was no longer the Kian Empire's domain to command, and deep down, humanity knew this. They had reached a point where they no longer feared the vastness of space or the might of an empire that had long overshadowed them. But that arrogance, that misunderstanding, was about to come crashing down. The transmission came in the dead of night. It was a simple, cold message from the Kian Empire, delivered to every major communications hub on Earth, bypassing all security protocols. Admiral Tessa Monroe was the first to receive it. She sat alone in her office, staring at the blank screen before her, her fingers hovering over the controls. The words that filled the screen were harsh, unforgiving. To the inhabitants of Earth, this is your final warning. The 1,000-year peace treaty signed by your ancestors has expired. You have refused to grant the Kian Empire exclusive rights to the mineral-rich planet located at the edge of your solar system. Your failure to comply will be met with consequences. Surrender your resources or face total annihilation. Your primitive civilization is no match for the might of the Kian Empire. We will remind you what it means to face a superior force. Surrender, or perish. Admiral Monroe read the message 3 times before she even blinked. There was no fear in her, no uncertainty. Only a sense of disbelief. The Kian had come, as they always did, with threats, with power, and with the same arrogance they had worn for centuries. And yet, this time, it was different. This time, something had changed. She sat back in her chair and sighed, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. They really think we're the same people they left behind 1,000 years ago, she muttered to herself. She tapped her comm device, signaling her top commanders. Admiral, is it true? Are they really declaring war on us? A voice crackled through the speaker. It is, Monroe replied, her voice steady. The Kian think we're still the same primitive species they left behind. They don't understand us at all. She paused, considering her words carefully. They think they can scare us. But they don't know what they're up against. In the Kian flagship, Supreme Commander Zorik sat in his command chair, his massive form looming over his officers. His 4 eyes blinked rapidly, betraying his impatience and growing frustration. "Prepare the fleet," he commanded coldly. "We will remind these humans what it means to cross the Kian Empire. This time, there will be no mercy." "Commander, our sensors indicate no defensive preparations," one of his officers spoke hesitantly. "Their planet seems wide open. It's almost as if they don't fear us." Zorik's upper appendages twitched in annoyance. "Fools. They do not understand their place in the galaxy. We will remind them." His voice was thick with disdain. As Zorik's fleet of massive warships prepared to leave their base, the Kian Empire's officers spoke in hushed tones. There was a sense of unease, a slight disturbance in their otherwise unshakable belief in their own superiority. For a moment, even the bravest of Kian warriors hesitated. They knew their commander's reputation, knew that Zorik would never retreat, never back down from a fight. And yet, deep down, something was stirring, a feeling of doubt, of uncertainty. Could these humans really be as insignificant as they thought? On Earth, Monroe and her staff had already begun preparing for the worst. But instead of fear, there was determination. They weren't going to let an alien empire, no matter how powerful, dictate their future. Humans had fought for every inch of their survival, from the first step on the moon to the bold leap into interstellar travel. No empire was going to erase that legacy. "I don't care how many warships they send," Monroe said, her voice calm but fierce. "We're not backing down. We've got technology they can't even begin to understand. And we've got something they'll never have, the will to fight for our freedom." The transmission from the Kian Empire had made it clear, the Kian believed they had the upper hand, that humanity was still weak, still malleable. They couldn't have been more wrong. Humans had spent 1,000 years quietly watching the stars, learning, growing, adapting. What the Kian didn't know was that during those peaceful years, humanity had evolved in ways that were unimaginable to an empire that thrived on brute force. And when the Kian fleet finally arrived at Earth's orbit, the humans would show them just how far they had come. The peace was over, but this time, it wasn't humanity that was weak. It was the Kian. And the world was ready to prove it. The Kian Empire had sent its message, and the threat was clear. Humanity was about to face the consequences of their refusal to give up the mineral-rich planet at the edge of their solar system. The Kian had no doubts, they had seen the potential of their fleet, the vastness of their numbers, and the undeniable might of their technology. Their victory, they thought, was inevitable. But what the Kian hadn't anticipated, what they couldn't have possibly prepared for, was humanity's response. When the transmission came to Earth, when the cold, imperial voice of Supreme Commander Zorik demanded Earth's surrender, the planet did not recoil in fear. They did not buckle under the weight of the threat. They laughed. Admiral Tessa Monroe stood in front of the massive holographic display in her command center, the gravity of the situation hanging in the air. The message from the Kian Empire had reached them a mere hour ago, and yet already, her calm had returned. She wasn't frightened. In fact, there was something deeply unsettling about how much of a relief it was to hear Zorik's ultimatum. She crossed her arms, leaning against the console, her gaze fixed on the looming image of the Kian commander. "Admiral," her communications officer said, "they're serious about this. They've mobilized the fleet. Should we prepare the defenses? Monroe's lips curled into a small smile, a smirk that didn't go unnoticed by the officers around her. Prepare to launch the fleet. Yes, she said calmly. But don't worry about their threats. They're not the ones we should be afraid of. The room was silent for a moment. A few officers exchanged glances, clearly perplexed. You've seen their fleet, Admiral, one of them hesitated. They have ships the size of moons. Their firepower. Monroe raised a hand to cut him off. And they still think we're the same species we were 1,000 years ago. They haven't even bothered to understand us. Her voice was steady, confident, but tinged with a sharp edge that cut through the tension. This is not a battle they're prepared for. They think they're coming to crush us, but they have no idea what they're up against. The door to the command center opened, and one of her senior officers, Commander Kyle, stepped in. He was still holding the data pad with the transmission from the Kian Empire. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to steady himself. Admiral, you saw what they said, right? They're not bluffing. Monroe turned slowly to face him, her eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. They've made the mistake of assuming we're afraid. And that, Commander, is their first miscalculation. She paused, glancing around the room. Humans are a species defined by defiance. We've survived against every odd, fought back when the universe itself tried to erase us. The Kian Empire thinks we're just going to roll over because they threatened us with extinction? No. They don't understand us. Kyle was silent for a moment, the words sinking in. You're right. We've been underestimating ourselves for too long. We've learned to stand tall, even when the universe seemed determined to knock us down. The conversation shifted back to the holographic screen, where the image of Zarek blinked impatiently. The Kian Supreme Commander's imposing form filled the room, his massive, alien features framed by the cold, metallic backdrop of his ship's bridge. We are the Kian Empire, Zarek's voice boomed from the speakers. You have had your time. Your peace is over. Surrender your resources to us, or you will face the consequences. Monroe met his gaze across the vast distance of space, her expression unwavering. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of history, of centuries of misunderstandings. She could feel the arrogance in his voice, the belief that he was speaking to a species that would fold under pressure. She didn't flinch. Commander Zarek, she said, her voice echoing through the room. Let me get this straight. You think we're going to surrender because you've declared war on us over a barren rock at the edge of our solar system? Zarek's eyes flickered with irritation. You humans have no comprehension of what you face. The treaty your ancestors signed expired long ago. We are entitled to these resources. Your pitiful civilization will fall. Monroe chuckled softly, the sound carrying through the tense atmosphere of the command center. You really don't get it, do you? She asked, shaking her head. You've been watching us for 1,000 years, and you still don't understand what makes us human. We didn't just survive, we thrived. And now, you're about to find out what happens when you try to take away what we've worked so hard for. Zarek's expression darkened, his massive form shifting with visible frustration. You laugh at us, he growled. You think you can defy the Kian Empire? I don't think, Monroe said calmly. I know. She turned to her officers, who were now standing at attention, ready to act. It's time to show them what humanity is really capable of. On the Kian flagship, Zarek seethed. His four eyes blinked rapidly, an indication of his growing agitation. "What is this?" he muttered, looking around at his officers. "Why aren't they afraid? Why aren't they begging for mercy?" His intelligence director, Lurer, stepped forward hesitantly, his exoskeleton clicking nervously. "Supreme Commander, our intelligence on humans is limited. The treaty prevented direct observation. We know they were primitive when we first encountered them, but we don't know what they've become in the last 1,000 years." Zorak's massive form stiffened. "We don't need to know more. Prepare the fleet. We will crush them with the power of our Armada." Lurer stepped back, uncertainty lingering in his voice. "But Commander, perhaps we should send a scout ship first. Assess their true capabilities before we commit." Zorak turned to him with a sneer, his four eyes narrowing. "Cowardice. We do not scout. We conquer. We will bring the full might of the Kian Empire to bear. Let them try to stop us." The conversation ended there, but as the Kian fleet moved toward Earth, the tension only mounted. Zorak and his officers had underestimated humanity's resilience, its capacity for ingenuity, and above all, its ability to laugh in the face of certain destruction. And as they neared Earth's orbit, it became clear that the real battle wasn't going to be fought with weapons or technology alone, it would be fought with something far more powerful: human will. The Kian fleet was a force to be reckoned with, an armada that stretched across the stars, 1,000 warships that could obliterate entire planets with a single wave of firepower. For the last 1,000 years, they had remained silent, watching as humanity grew, believing that their dominance was undisputed. The peace they had agreed to, the 1,000-year truce, had allowed humanity to thrive, but in the back of the Kian Empire's mind, it had always been temporary. Now, the time had come to reclaim what they thought was rightfully theirs, the mineral-rich planets on the fringes of humanity's solar system. The Kian Supreme Commander, Zorak, had given the order. There would be no negotiation. No second chances. The time for talking was over, and the time for action had begun. As Zorak's fleet moved toward Earth's solar system, his officers, still shaken by the unexpected human defiance, scrambled to prepare for what they assumed would be a swift victory. The officers on the bridge of the Kian flagship worked frantically, but their unease was palpable. Despite their previous confidence, doubts had begun to creep in. They had expected a species on the verge of extinction, a group of primitive beings who had never faced the might of a true empire. But now, with each passing moment, as the distance between them and Earth narrowed, the reality of what they were about to face became all too clear. "We're approaching the outer rim of their solar system, Commander," one of Zorak's senior officers reported. "The human defenses have yet to show any signs of resistance." Zorak's four eyes blinked slowly, the first hint of doubt breaking through his usual stoicism. "It's a trap," he muttered under his breath. "They want us to think they're unprepared. They want us to lower our guard. They're playing games." But the truth was, no one on the Kian ship knew for certain what to expect. The humans had done the unthinkable, they had laughed in the face of the Kians' threats. It was something no species had ever done to the Kian. For centuries, they had crushed civilizations with little effort, but here, against humanity, they were confronted by something they couldn't understand: confidence, intelligence, and the ability to defy. "We've never seen anything like this before, Commander," said Lurer, the Kian intelligence officer. "Their behavior is erratic. Unpredictable. It doesn't fit the usual pattern of conquered civilizations." Zorak's grip tightened on the armrests of his chair, his upper appendages warping the metal beneath his fingers. His mind raced. How had they evolved so quickly? The last time they had encountered humanity, they were barely more than an afterthought, a species with primitive technology. What have they become? The transmission from Admiral Monroe echoed in his mind, her voice taunting him. "You have no idea what you're up against," she had said. "We've been preparing for this moment for centuries. You'll find we've changed." Zorik turned toward Lurer, his voice strained. "How have they changed? You told me that their technology was still in its infancy, that their weapons were primitive, their tactics nothing to be afraid of. Now you tell me they're prepared for war." Lurer hesitated, his exoskeleton clicking nervously. "I can't explain it, Commander. All I know is what we've observed from a distance. We've seen no signs of the humans' true potential, until now. Their military capacity, it's unlike anything we've encountered. We don't know the full extent of their power." "Then it's time we find out," Zorik growled. "Prepare the fleet for engagement. We'll make an example of them. The galaxy will see what happens when you defy the Kian Empire." As Zorik barked his orders, the Kian Armada surged forward, crossing the boundary of the solar system. But the closer they got to Earth, the more uneasy Zorik became. The humans, who had been nothing but a speck on the radar for centuries, were now an unknown quantity, and he was beginning to realize that they were not as weak as they had once seemed. "All ships, form battle lines," Zorik ordered, though the words felt strange in his mouth. The Kian fleet, organized and precise, began to fall into their expected formation. Yet, there was something unsettling about the lack of response from the humans. The vastness of space stretched before them, Earth's blue orb sitting silently in the distance. "They're waiting for us," Zorik muttered. "They know we're coming. We've detected unusual readings from their outer defenses, Commander," said another officer, his voice laced with concern. "But no sign of active defense systems. No engagement protocols. It's almost as if they're unaware we're here." Zorik's frustration grew. "Impossible," he spat. "They've been watching us for 1,000 years, and now they act like they don't know we're here? They're playing some game, waiting to spring their trap." "We'll find out soon enough, Commander," Lurer replied quietly. But their reluctance to respond is odd. Too confident, perhaps. As the Kian ships closed the gap, the final leg of the journey was fraught with tension. The fleet passed through the gas giants of Neptune and Uranus, their massive warships cutting through the emptiness of space with an almost eerie silence. It was then that something changed, something that Zorik couldn't put his finger on. A slight hesitation, a shift in the atmosphere on the bridge. "Commander, we've reached Saturn," the navigator called out. "There is still no sign of human resistance." Zorik narrowed his eyes. "This doesn't make sense." He should have felt a surge of triumph, should have been preparing for the inevitable victory, but instead, there was a nagging doubt at the back of his mind. The Kian had never faced an enemy like this, and their calm, their certainty, was making Zorik uneasy. "We're almost there," Zorik said, his voice cold. "Let's see if these humans continue to hide behind their bravado." But as the Kian Armada approached the final leg of their journey, to the place where they had anticipated the humans would make their stand, they encountered something unexpected. A series of strange, anomalous readings began to pulse through the ship's systems. Zorik's eyes flicked toward the tactical displays. "What is that?" he demanded. "Commander, something is happening with Saturn's rings," said the science officer, his voice shaking. "They're moving." Zorik shot out of his chair, his heart racing as the display showed the impossible, sections of Saturn's rings were shifting, altering their positions against the established orbital mechanics. A sense of unease swept through the crew. The rings weren't just shifting, they were transforming. The realization hit them all at once, and Zorek's voice barely escaped his throat as he barked, "Get me a visual. Now." As the view screen flickered to life, a stunning sight unfolded before them. The rings of Saturn were no longer made of ice and rock. They were ships, tiny, countless ships, emerging from their hiding places. They had been camouflaged, perfectly mimicking the natural debris of the planet's rings, blending seamlessly into the cosmic dust. And now they were moving, forming into a perfect, organized formation. "Impossible," Zorek whispered, disbelief sinking into his bones. "They've been hiding in plain sight, waiting." And then, Admiral Monroe's voice came through the comms once again. It was calm. Taunting. "Welcome to the solar system, Commander. I see you've brought the whole family." Her tone was nothing short of maddening. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Zorek's heart pounded in his chest. The humans had been ready for them, even before they had arrived. They had anticipated every move, every strategy, and now the Kian Empire stood at the brink of a new kind of war, one they had never seen coming. As the Kian Armada moved into the heart of the solar system, Zorek's frustration grew. The once confident supreme commander of the Kian Empire now found himself standing on the precipice of a monumental realization. The human ships, previously thought to be nothing more than primitive remnants of a fledgling species, were suddenly moving with an agility and precision that defied all logic. The swarm of tiny vessels that had emerged from the rings of Saturn was more than just an impressive display, it was a direct challenge to the overwhelming might of the Kian Empire. Zorek's eyes flicked to the holographic display of Earth's defenses. Every calculation, every move, was being countered with ease by the human swarm. This wasn't supposed to happen, he thought. The Kian Empire had never encountered an enemy that refused to follow the rules of warfare. The strategy was simple: overwhelm and conquer. But the humans were doing something entirely different. They were dancing around his fleet. "Commander," the science officer's voice trembled over the comms, they're evading every single one of our attacks. It's as if they're anticipating our moves before we make them." Zorek's gaze hardened. "Impossible," he muttered. "Their technology should be no match for ours. They should be helpless. We've seen their weapons, primitive, outdated. This doesn't make sense." Yet, as Zorek watched in horror, the human ships continued to weave between the blasts of plasma fire, twisting and turning with an impossible grace. His fleet's most advanced weapons, capable of obliterating entire civilizations in seconds, were falling short against this unexpected defense. "Commander, their movements are coordinated. It's like they're one organism, acting as a single entity." Lurer, the Kian intelligence officer, said, stepping forward, his voice laced with disbelief. "Then explain it." Zorek snapped, his frustration boiling over. He turned to his tactical officer. "What are their shields made of? Why can't we breach them?" The officer checked the readings, his fingers tapping frantically against his console. "They don't have shields, Commander," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "At least, not in the way we understand them. These ships, they're bypassing our defenses, moving through our energy barriers like they don't even exist." A cold shiver ran down Zorek's spine. For the first time, he felt the raw weight of humanity's unexpected advantage. The Kian Empire had always relied on superior firepower to win battles, crushing foes beneath their overwhelming might. But these humans were different. They weren't simply fighting back, they were outsmarting the Kian at every turn. "They're not using force to defend themselves," Zorik murmured, almost to himself. "They're using intelligence." The realization hit him hard. The humans had done something no other species in the galaxy had ever done. They had figured out how to fight without relying solely on brute strength. Their technology wasn't based on weapons or overwhelming numbers. It was based on adaptability, on learning, on using every bit of their intelligence to counter the Kian's might. "Commander," Lurer spoke again, his voice steady but filled with the weight of new information, "we've been underestimating them for centuries. They've developed a level of technology we didn't know existed. They've outpaced us." Zorik's mind raced. How had this happened? 1,000 years ago, humans had barely achieved space travel. Their weapons were crude, their tactics unrefined. But now, they were turning the tables on one of the most powerful empires the galaxy had ever known. The human ships moved with a precision that was simply too advanced, too intelligent for their primitive origins. Zorik turned to face his fleet's battle strategist, his voice strained with disbelief. "What exactly are we fighting here, Commander? What are these ships?" The strategist hesitated, then spoke. "They're autonomous. Entirely controlled by AI. They're learning, adapting, in real time. These ships aren't simply responding to our attacks, they're predicting them. It's as if the humans have created a system that can think for itself." Zorik was silent for a moment, staring at the display of the human ships effortlessly dodging the Kian's attacks. His empire, which had once been the pinnacle of technological advancement, was now facing an enemy that wasn't just technologically advanced, it was evolving in the heat of battle. "Why didn't we see this?" Zorik asked, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He could no longer deny it. The humans had been holding back. They had known exactly what they were doing, and now, in this moment of crisis, they were showing their true power. Lurer's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "We had no idea, Commander. The peace treaty, it kept us from observing them directly. All we saw was a primitive species, struggling with their own survival. We never considered what they could become." The silence in the room was deafening. Zorik's mind spun, trying to piece together what he was seeing. It was more than just a technological leap, it was a paradigm shift. The humans had gone from barely surviving to mastering the very principles of warfare that had once made the Kian Empire invincible. Monroe's voice, once again, crackled through the Kian communications. "You think you can defeat us with your weapons and your tactics, Zorik? We've been studying you for centuries. Your strategies are predictable. Your weapons are outdated. And now, you'll see what happens when you face a species that isn't afraid to adapt." Zorik's jaw clenched, the bite of her words sinking deep into his pride. He had been sure, so sure, that the Kian Empire's might would crush the humans without effort. But now, standing in the face of their overwhelming ingenuity, he was beginning to doubt his certainty. They hadn't just underestimated the humans, they had completely misread them. "Commander," Lurer said, his voice shaking with newfound respect, "they've built these ships with a level of automation we've never seen before. The technology, the algorithms, they're far ahead of anything we've ever known. They've been using this time, these 1,000 years of peace, to develop new strategies, new forms of combat." Zorik's hands tightened into fists, the realization hitting him like a thunderclap. The humans had used their peace to build, to advance, to prepare for the moment when they would face the Kian Empire. And now that moment had arrived, and the Kian were no longer the dominant force in the galaxy. "What do we do?" the strategist asked, his voice filled with dread. Zorak's answer was cold, yet tinged with reluctant admiration. "We adapt, too. Prepare to engage with full force. We may have underestimated them, but we will not lose. Not yet." The Kian ships rumbled as they moved into battle formation, their weapons primed for destruction. But as Zorak watched the human swarm continue to dodge and weave, his mind raced with one unshakable thought: the game had changed. And now, he had no choice but to play by humanity's rules. The Kian Empire was used to domination. For millennia, they had swept across the galaxy, leaving worlds in their wake, vanquishing all who dared challenge their might. They had always known how to win, by overwhelming force, by sheer numbers, and by relentless, unyielding power. But as Zorak and his fleet drew closer to Earth, something unexpected had happened. They had underestimated humanity, completely misjudged their resilience, their intelligence, and above all, their refusal to bow down. Admiral Tessa Monroe stood in front of the massive holographic display in her command center, watching the Kian fleet approach Earth's orbit. Her mind raced, but there was no fear. Just clarity. The Kian had expected them to cower. They thought humanity was still the same species they had left behind, the one they had treated as insignificant. What they didn't understand was that the 1,000 years of peace had been spent building something new, something that could not be destroyed by brute force alone. Monroe's voice broke the silence in the room, filled with the quiet hum of anticipation. "Get ready, people," she said, her tone calm but firm. "The Kian think we're weak. They think we're just a footnote in their conquest. But they're about to find out how wrong they are." Her officers exchanged looks, some still processing the scale of the enemy they were facing, others already focused on the task ahead. "Admiral, we've got the swarm ready," Commander Kyle reported, his voice tight with the pressure of the moment. "But we can't engage until they make their move." Monroe nodded, her eyes fixed on the looming threat. "They will. But not the way they think." In the Kian flagship, Zorak's four eyes narrowed as he watched the Earth's defenses, those tiny, insignificant human ships, move with an elegance and precision he could not fathom. They had no shields, no advanced weaponry, nothing compared to the power of the Kian Armada. And yet, as his fleet unleashed waves of fire, the human ships danced, evading every shot with an almost mocking ease. "We are wasting time, Commander," Zorak growled. "Their resistance is futile. Engage the fleet, and let us show them what happens when they defy the Kian Empire." As his command rang out, the Kian ships unleashed their fury. Plasma cannons and energy blasts rained down upon the human swarm, illuminating space with their destructive power. But the human ships, those small, seemingly fragile vessels, continued to dodge and weave with an almost preternatural skill. They didn't just evade, they danced. It was as though they were anticipating every move, every attack before it even happened. Zorak watched in disbelief as one of his capital ships fired a direct shot at a human ship, only for the ship to veer sharply, twisting out of the way at a speed that should have been impossible for anything without the protection of advanced shielding. The Kian weapons slammed into the emptiness of space, their blasts evaporating harmlessly into the void. Commander, Lurer, the Kian intelligence officer, spoke with a note of urgency. "They're not just dodging our attacks, they're predicting them. This is not possible. We've never encountered anything like this." Zorak's fists clenched, his frustration building. "Why aren't we hitting them?" he bellowed. "How are they moving like this? Their technology is supposed to be primitive. Lurer hesitated, then spoke carefully. It's not just their technology. It's their tactics. They are using their ships as an extension of their will, as though they've synchronized every vessel to move as one. It's almost like they're not just reacting to us, they're reading our intentions. Zorak's eyes flickered with realization. They aren't just fighting, they're adapting, evolving in real time. The realization settled in his mind like a weight, crushing any illusion that this would be a simple conquest. Humanity had built a system of defense unlike anything he had ever seen, and it wasn't based on firepower. It was based on human intelligence, on their ability to outthink and outmaneuver their opponents. It was something the Kian had never truly understood. Back on Earth, Admiral Monroe watched as the swarm continued its evasive maneuvers, the human ships weaving through the Kian fire like dancers in a choreographed performance. It was breathtaking in its precision. She knew exactly what was happening, she knew how the human ships were able to do this. I told them, Monroe muttered to herself, watching the Kian fleet grow increasingly frustrated, we've been studying them for 1,000 years. It's their arrogance that's led them here, to underestimate us. She turned to Commander Kyle, her face calm but with a spark of determination in her eyes. Let's show them what happens when you think you know us. A deep, resonant hum filled the command center, signaling that the swarm had reached the next phase of the plan. The human ships, small in comparison to the massive Kian warships, began to accelerate in perfect formation, weaving between each other with an impossible speed. And then, as the Kian fleet continued to fire upon them, the human ships did something no one could have predicted. They phased through the Kian's defensive barriers as if they didn't exist at all. Zorak's voice came over the communications channel, a roar of disbelief. What is happening? They're phase shifting. How is this possible? Lurer's voice trembled with astonishment. Commander, they've found a way to move through solid matter. The human ships, they're not just evading our attacks, they're ignoring them. Monroe's smirk grew wider as the human swarm began to take a more aggressive stance. The Kian warships were left vulnerable, their defenses useless against the strange new tactic the humans had unveiled. The first few human ships phased through the Kian defenses and made contact with the hulls of the Kian warships. Within seconds, the Kian ships began to disintegrate, their metal structures breaking apart at the molecular level, evaporating into clouds of atoms. The Kian officers could only watch in horror as 20 of their warships were obliterated in an instant, their once mighty vessels reduced to nothing but vapor. Impossible, Zorak whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. They can't. How did they develop this technology? Monroe's voice cut through the chaos. You wanted a demonstration, Zorak. There it is. Humanity has learned to bend the rules of physics, to manipulate matter at its most fundamental level. You thought we were primitive. You thought we were easy prey. But you're wrong. Zorak's chest tightened as he watched his fleet suffer. His confidence had crumbled, replaced by a cold, gnawing fear. The humans had done something no other species had ever done, they had taken the very laws of nature and turned them into a weapon. They're not just fighting us, Zorak realized aloud. They're remaking the battlefield. Monroe's voice, still calm and steady, resonated in Zorak's mind. The game has changed, Commander. And you're the one who didn't see it coming. Zorak had never experienced fear, not in the way he was feeling now. The Kian Empire had ruled with unchallenged might for centuries, its legions conquering worlds without so much as a pause. But now, as the battle raged in the vast expanse of space above Earth, Zorik found himself facing a foe unlike any other, a species that had, in the span of mere centuries, surpassed the Kian's understanding of warfare and technology. Humanity, once considered primitive and weak, had become a force to be reckoned with. The swarm of human ships, though small and seemingly insignificant, had now revealed their true power. Zorik's once invincible fleet was being dismantled, not by sheer numbers, but by the very laws of physics. The humans had discovered a way to bypass the Kian's most advanced technologies, moving through solid matter as if it were nothing more than a mere suggestion. The Kian, with their immeasurable power, were losing. And in the heart of the chaos, Monroe's calm voice rang out once again, like a sharp reminder of the human will. "You wanted to see our strength, Zorik?" she asked over the comms, her voice cool but filled with the weight of a challenge that Zorik could no longer ignore. "Welcome to the new reality." Zorik's four eyes blinked rapidly, struggling to process the scene unfolding before him. Human ships phased through the defensive barriers of his fleet, disintegrating entire Kian warships at the molecular level with a terrifying precision. The energy shields and plasma cannons that had made the Kian Empire nearly untouchable in the past were now nothing more than a distant memory, incapable of touching the human swarm that danced between the waves of fire, unaffected and deadly. For a moment, Zorik stood frozen, the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation dawning on him. The Kian had underestimated humanity, not just their technology, but their ingenuity, their ability to evolve faster than any species in the galaxy had ever dreamed. They're rewriting the rules of warfare," Zorik muttered, a trace of panic in his voice. "This can't be happening." Lurer, the intelligence officer, stepped forward, his usual composure shattered by the sheer improbability of the situation. "Commander, it's worse than we thought. The humans, they've already thought ahead. They've outpaced us," Zorik said, the words coming out in a tone he never thought he would hear himself utter. "We're being defeated by their adaptability. They're using physics itself as a weapon. The human ships, each one a small speck against the vast Kian Armada, continued to phase in and out of existence, passing effortlessly through the Kian's defensive shields and defenses, leaving disintegrated Kian warships in their wake. The Kian fleet was crumbling under the weight of its own hubris. "We need to regroup," Zorik commanded, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. Every move he had made, every strategy he had employed, had been calculated to deliver an easy victory. Now, he felt like a chess player who had just realized the game was not only over but that he had never truly understood the rules. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Monroe watched the battle unfold with the same unshaken confidence. She knew what was coming. The Kian might have been powerful, but they had never faced an enemy that fought with the same spirit, the same refusal to surrender. Humanity had always been the underdog, but it was the underdog that had learned to fight smarter, harder, and more innovatively than anyone expected. "Admiral," Commander Kyle said, his voice laced with awe and disbelief, "it's working. The swarm is overwhelming them. But this isn't the end, is it?" Monroe didn't answer immediately. She turned to her crew, her face reflecting the seriousness of the situation. "No," she said finally. "This is only the beginning. We're showing them that we're not the weak species they thought we were. But there's more to humanity than just technology. There's our will to survive, our ability to think beyond what's possible." "Are you saying, we've got something else up our sleeve?" Kyle asked, raising an eyebrow. Monroe smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with an intensity that had kept her grounded throughout the conflict. "Exactly. What you're seeing now is just a demonstration. A little teaser of what we've been preparing for. You think they can't be stopped? Let's show them just how wrong they are. On the Kian flagship, Zorik clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. What more could they possibly have? They've already broken every rule we've established. Lurer stepped forward, his voice trembling. Commander, I think we've underestimated their potential. If they've been able to bend the laws of physics, then what's stopping them from taking this even further? If they can control matter at the molecular level, they could create weapons we haven't even conceived of yet. Zorik's mind reeled at the implications. He had always prided himself on understanding the way the universe worked. The Kian Empire had mastered space, had built their power on the foundation of absolute control. But these humans, this species, which had once been nothing but an afterthought, had found a way to change the very rules of existence. They will be our downfall, Zorik said quietly, though the words felt like a curse. They are no longer just a species to be conquered. They are a force we cannot comprehend. As if to punctuate Zorik's thoughts, the human swarm began to move in perfect synchronization. The ships accelerated, weaving through space in patterns that seemed to defy the limits of physics. Then, with terrifying precision, they began to converge on the Kian fleet, forming a massive gravitational anomaly in the heart of the battle. What are they doing? Lurer asked, his voice tinged with fear. It's a gravity well, Zorik said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. But it's not like anything we've ever seen before. The Kian fleet watched in horror as the human ships continued to spin and twist, generating a powerful gravitational force that began to warp the fabric of space itself. For a brief moment, it seemed as though time itself was bending, space rippling like a sheet of water. The Kian ships were drawn toward the center of the anomaly, unable to break free. Zorik's eyes widened in horror. They're creating a star, an artificial singularity. No. This isn't possible. Monroe's voice, calm and collected, came through once more, filling the Kian's comms with a message that echoed across the void. You wanted a demonstration, Zorik. This is just a taste of what we can do. You think your might is unbeatable? You have no idea how far we've come. And as the Kian fleet struggled against the powerful forces created by humanity's newfound abilities, Zorik was forced to confront the undeniable truth: humanity was no longer the species they had once dismissed. They had become something more, something that threatened the very foundation of the Kian Empire itself. The battle had spiraled out of control. Zorik, the supreme commander of the Kian Empire, had always prided himself on the Empire's power and invincibility. But now, as the human swarm continued to outmaneuver and overpower his fleet, he was faced with a crushing realization. The Kian Armada, once the most fearsome military force in the galaxy, was being torn apart by a species they had written off as insignificant. The very thing that had seemed like an easy conquest was now a fight for survival. The gravity well that humanity had created was still expanding, pulling the Kian ships toward its core. Zorik had ordered his fleet to attempt evasive maneuvers, but it was clear that his forces were helpless. The gravitational forces were beyond anything the Kian had encountered. No amount of firepower, no amount of technological superiority, could break them free from the anomaly. Every movement they made only worsened their position. We're being drawn in, one of Zorik's senior officers shouted, panic creeping into his voice. The fleet can't break free. The human ships have trapped us. Zorik's fist slammed against the command console, the sound reverberating through the bridge. I know, he roared, his frustration mounting. Regroup. We need to reverse course, now. But the human ships showed no signs of slowing down. They had turned the battle into something Zorik couldn't comprehend. The humans weren't just defending themselves, they were controlling the very fabric of space, warping reality itself. Zorik had heard whispers of human advancements in quantum mechanics, but this was something entirely different. They're not just bending the laws of physics, Lurer said, his voice barely a whisper, they're breaking them. We're not fighting a species, we're fighting concepts. Zorik's mind reeled. How could they have achieved this? The humans had no right to be this advanced. They had been nothing more than primitive, resource-depleted beings, living on a dying world. And yet, in just 1,000 years, they had surpassed everything the Kian Empire had worked for in 10,000. He looked out over the chaos on the battlefield, where Kian warships were being consumed by the growing gravity well, their engines straining against the pull, but to no avail. The once unstoppable Kian Armada was now a sitting target, caught in the snare of humanity's unprecedented power. Zorik could feel his own control slipping away. "Commander," another officer called out urgently. "The fleet is being compromised. We've lost 20 ships already and more are being pulled in. If we don't pull back soon, we'll be wiped out entirely." Zorik's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Kian had never been outmatched before. But now, facing the reality of the human strength, Zorik understood something terrifying. This wasn't just a war, this was humanity proving they could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. And the Kian Empire was losing. He turned to Lurer, his voice strained. "Is there any hope of victory now? Anything we can do to regain control?" Lurer met his gaze, his normally unwavering demeanor cracked. "The only option, Commander, is retreat. The human swarm has proven we can't defeat them with our current tactics. They're too advanced for us. We're simply too far behind." Zorik's chest tightened. The word he dreaded most, the one word that had been unthinkable, had just been spoken aloud: retreat. The Kian Empire didn't retreat. They conquered. They crushed their enemies without mercy. But now, they were on the brink of annihilation. Humanity's demonstration of raw power had shattered the Kians' arrogance, and with it, their sense of invincibility. "This is not possible," Zorik muttered, his voice barely audible. "We've never been defeated. Not like this." Lurer's voice was quiet, but his words held an undeniable weight. "Perhaps we've underestimated them for far too long." Zorik stood still for a moment, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. The universe that had once bowed to the Kian Empire was now slipping away. What does it mean to be an empire if you can no longer conquer? The thought haunted him. He had lived for one purpose, to lead the Kian to dominance. But in the face of humanity's ingenuity, that purpose had now come into question. "Commander," Lurer said, his voice softer now. "We can't let pride be our downfall. If we stay, we'll lose everything. We must withdraw while we still have the chance to survive." The words stung, but Zorik knew Lurer was right. The Kian Empire's might had always been based on one fundamental belief, that they could crush anyone who stood in their way. But humanity had proven that might alone was not enough. It was intelligence, innovation, and sheer willpower that had triumphed here. Zorik swallowed his pride, his voice cold as he turned to his officers. "Prepare the fleet. We're retreating." There was a long silence before anyone moved. It wasn't just fear or reluctance, it was the crushing weight of history shifting. For the first time in Zorik's career, he was giving an order that would forever change the course of the Kian Empire. "Commander," one of his officers said, her voice tentative. "We're abandoning the mission?" After everything. Zorak's eyes burned with a mixture of anger and resignation. Yes, he said firmly. We're abandoning the mission. We've underestimated the humans. But this is not over. We will learn. We will adapt. And we will come back stronger. His words were a thin mask for the deep shame that was gnawing at him. What had gone wrong? The Kian had always been the superior species, and yet they were now retreating from a battle they should have won effortlessly. As Zorak's fleet began to pull back, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would haunt him forever. The Kian Empire was retreating, not because they feared defeat, but because they had been forced to confront a truth they had ignored for too long. Humanity had changed the game. And in that realization, Zorak saw something that chilled him more than any weapon could, the possibility that the Kian Empire might no longer be the apex predators of the galaxy. As the Kian fleet moved out of Earth's orbit, Zorak couldn't help but glance at the human ships still hovering in the distance. They were quiet now, but Zorak knew that the humans had been ready for this. They had won, not with sheer force, but with something much more terrifying, the ability to innovate, to break the rules, and to redefine what was possible. And with that, for the first time in his long career, Zorak understood what true defeat felt like. The Kian fleet had retreated. What had once seemed like an inevitable victory for the Kian Empire had turned into a humiliating defeat, not at the hands of superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by the ingenuity and resolve of humanity. Zorak, once proud and unshakable, was left with a bitter taste of failure. His empire, the most powerful in the galaxy, had been bested by a species that, in his mind, should have been nothing more than a footnote in the history of the universe. But humanity had shown him, and the entire Kian Empire, just how far they had come in their 1,000 years of peace. As the fleet limped back to Kian Prime, Zorak was lost in thought. The vastness of space had always been the Kians' domain, and for centuries, they had conquered it with an iron fist. But the humans had changed everything. They had fought not with strength alone, but with intellect, adaptability, and a relentless will to survive. Zorak could not shake the nagging thought that this war was only the beginning, and that the Kian Empire was no longer the dominant force in the galaxy. But as his fleet made its way back to their home world, something unexpected happened. A small shuttle emerged from the edge of the fleet, its sleek form barely noticeable against the backdrop of Kian warships. Zorak's tactical officer glanced at the display in confusion. "Commander, there's a human vessel approaching. It's small, unarmed, should we engage?" Zorak's eyes narrowed. A human vessel? Here? After everything that's happened? The idea seemed absurd. Yet, despite his anger and humiliation, he felt a strange pull of curiosity. "Let it through," he ordered. "Let's see what this human has to say." As the shuttle docked with the Kian flagship, Zorak stood on the bridge, his arms crossed. His officers stood at attention, their faces a mix of confusion and wariness. The air was thick with the tension of defeat, and no one knew what to expect from the human visitor. The hatch of the shuttle opened, and to Zorak's surprise, it wasn't Admiral Monroe who stepped forward. Instead, a man, tall, lean, and dressed in simple civilian clothing, emerged. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the Kian officers in the room, but it was his calm, confident demeanor that drew Zorak's attention. The man didn't flinch or show any sign of fear, despite being surrounded by the Kian elite. "Supreme Commander Zorak," the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "I am Dr. Jackson Webb, a representative of humanity. Admiral Monroe sends her regards." Zorak stared at the human, his eyes narrowing. Why are you here? He demanded. Your species has humiliated us, and now you send a representative to talk. What is it you seek, human? Dr. Webb smiled, as though he had expected this reaction. I came to offer something, an olive branch, if you will, he replied. I also came to deliver a message. He paused, his eyes glinting with a quiet wisdom. The war you thought you were winning? It's not over. In fact, it's just begun. The humans you underestimated have evolved. And we didn't just evolve technologically, we've learned something far more important. Zorak's brows furrowed. And what would that be? He growled, impatience creeping into his voice. The ability to adapt, to innovate under pressure, and above all, the will to survive. You see, Commander, humanity doesn't just fight wars. We create futures. Zorak felt a strange unease coil in his chest. He had heard of humans before, weak, primitive, barely worthy of the title civilization. Yet the way this man spoke, the calm confidence in his words, made Zorak question everything he had believed about humanity. We were prepared for this war, Dr. Webb continued, but not just because of what we can do with technology. We've prepared for it because we understand that we are not the only force in this universe, and we must evolve if we want to survive. Zorak didn't speak for a long moment. The words lingered in his mind, unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. He had assumed that the humans' ability to innovate was their greatest weapon. But it wasn't just that. It was the fact that they were willing to learn, to change, to adapt. And that was something the Kian Empire had never fully understood. I came here not to beg for mercy, Dr. Webb said, his voice steady. You've already seen that we won't bow to threats. But I came to offer you a different path forward. A path where we work together, not as enemies, but as allies. Zorak's eyes flashed with suspicion. An alliance, he spat. You believe we could work together after what you've done to us? You've humiliated the greatest empire in the galaxy. Dr. Webb's expression didn't change. Yes, we humiliated you, he acknowledged. But we didn't do it out of malice. We did it because we had to. You forced us into this position. Now, the question is, can you learn from this? Can you evolve, like we did? Zorak clenched his fists, the weight of his pride bearing down on him. He had never been one to back down from a fight. But Dr. Webb's words gnawed at him. Could the Kian Empire evolve? Could they adapt to this new reality where power alone wasn't enough to guarantee victory? For the first time, Zorak found himself questioning the very foundation of his empire. The Kian had built their strength on domination, on control. But now, humanity had shown them a different way. A way that, despite all their might, the Kian Empire couldn't deny. I'm not here to offer you salvation, Zorak, Dr. Webb said, his gaze steady. But I am here to offer you a chance to move forward. To change. Humanity has learned from its mistakes, and we've come to understand that we can't survive alone. There are threats out there, threats that neither of our species can face alone. But together, we stand a chance. Zorak's mind raced, the weight of his failure still heavy on his shoulders. But in Dr. Webb's eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected, hope. Not just for humanity, but for the Kian as well. It was a small seed, planted in the wake of defeat, but it was there. And as much as he hated to admit it, Zorak realized that humanity had something the Kian didn't, a future that could be forged through cooperation, not conquest. What do you propose? Zorak asked, his voice low, reluctant. Dr. Webb smiled again, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. A partnership. A shared future. One where we combine our strengths, our knowledge, and our will to survive. There's more at stake here than just our two species. There are greater threats in the universe, threats that neither of us can face alone. Zorak's gaze hardened. The Kian Empire had always been about domination, about power. But now, in the face of humanity's challenge, he realized that survival didn't always come from domination. Sometimes, it came from knowing when to change. If you're asking me to abandon everything we've built, Zorak said, his voice grim, it won't be easy. There are those in the Empire who will never accept this. But perhaps we have more to learn from you than we thought. Dr. Webb's expression softened. You're not alone in this, Commander. We all have lessons to learn. But we can't do it alone. And neither can you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had been said. Zorak knew that what Dr. Webb offered wasn't just a chance for peace, it was a chance to evolve. And though it felt like a bitter pill to swallow, Zorak realized that for the first time in his long career, the Kian Empire might need to do just that. The silence that followed Dr. Webb's proposal hung in the air like a dense fog, heavy with uncertainty. Zorak stood before him, his mind racing, processing the events that had led him here. He had once believed that strength, pure, overwhelming strength, was the key to survival. The Kian Empire had been built on that very principle, and it had carried them through countless conquests. But now, humanity had shown him a different path, a path that went beyond brute force. The words adaptation and cooperation still echoed in his ears, and they clung to him like an uncomfortable truth. For the first time in his career, Zorak was forced to confront the reality that the Kian Empire, for all its power, might not be enough to guarantee its survival anymore. And what humanity had shown him, the ability to adapt and innovate, was something the Kian had never truly embraced. Zorak turned away from Dr. Webb, his thoughts spiraling. His gaze drifted toward the vast expanse of space visible through the viewing portal. The stars stretched endlessly before him, a reminder that the universe was far larger and more complex than the Kian had ever allowed themselves to see. And humanity, it seemed, had found a way to navigate that complexity. How do you propose we move forward? Zorak's voice broke the silence, but it was softer than usual, a touch of vulnerability seeping through. You ask us to change, to abandon the very principles that have defined our existence for millennia. Dr. Webb's expression was one of quiet understanding, the kind of understanding that Zorak had not expected from a human. He had thought them naive, easily crushed under the weight of an empire like his. But now, standing in front of him, Webb exuded a quiet strength that Zorak couldn't ignore. It won't be easy, Webb said, his voice steady. No one ever said change was simple. But it's the only way forward. The threats humanity faces now are not ones we can handle alone, and certainly not ones you can handle alone. The universe is shifting. And the Kian Empire, as mighty as it is, cannot stand alone in this new reality. Zorak felt the weight of Webb's words, each one a challenge to everything he had ever known. The Kian had always believed that they were the apex predators in the galaxy, that no force could rival their might. But humanity's technological leaps, their ability to adapt, and their unshakable will to survive had shattered that illusion. You speak of threats, Zorak said, his voice quiet but laced with curiosity. What threats are you referring to? We've ruled the galaxy for centuries. Who could possibly pose a danger to us? Webb met Zorak's gaze, and there was something almost sad in his eyes. There are things in the universe far older and more powerful than either of us. Things that don't want to be found, things that are watching us, waiting. If we keep down this path of division, we won't be ready when they strike. We need to come together, Kian and humans alike. There are dangers out there that neither of our species can face alone. The question is, can you trust us enough to stand beside us? Zorak's mind raced. He had always known that the universe held mysteries far beyond his understanding. But the idea of facing an unknown, something more powerful than the Kian Empire, struck him deeply. Trust. It was a word that felt foreign in his mouth. For centuries, the Kian had ruled by sheer will and force. Trust had never been a part of their equation. Yet here, now, he was being asked to put his faith not just in humanity, but in the future of their combined existence. The thought unsettled him. The Kian Empire does not join with others, Zorak said, the word slow and deliberate. We dominate. We conquer. We take what is ours. And that's why we're at a crossroads, Webb replied, his tone soft but resolute. What you call domination has worked for you, yes. But at what cost? How much longer can an empire built on conquest survive in a universe that's changing faster than your fleets can move? Zorak's jaw tightened. He was not used to being questioned, especially by a human. But in that moment, the truth of Webb's words settled deep within him. He had never thought about the cost of the Kian Empire's dominance. He had never questioned the methods that had made them the most feared empire in the galaxy. But now, standing in front of him, was a species that had learned to survive and thrive without relying on domination. I've spent my entire life building this empire, Zorak said, his voice breaking for the first time. My people have dedicated themselves to this path. And now you ask me to abandon it? Webb's gaze softened, and for the first time, Zorak saw not just the strategist, not just the leader, but the man standing before him. I'm not asking you to abandon everything you've built, Webb said gently. I'm asking you to see that there is a way forward, a way where we both survive, where we both thrive. It's not about domination anymore. It's about cooperation. About moving forward together. There's more at stake than just our two species. There's a future ahead of us, if we can just take that first step. Zorak stood in silence, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The Kian Empire had been built on a foundation of conquest, on the belief that strength would always prevail. And yet, here he was, questioning everything he had ever known. Humanity had proven themselves to be more than a mere nuisance, more than a species to be dismissed. They had shown him that strength was not only about power, it was about adaptability, about learning from mistakes, and about knowing when to evolve. This is madness, Zorak muttered, though he couldn't help but feel the weight of Webb's words. No, Webb replied, his voice firm. This is the future. And if we don't evolve, if we don't learn to work together, we will all fall. This isn't just about your empire or mine. This is about survival. Zorak turned back to face the vastness of space, the endless stretch of stars that had once seemed so familiar to him, but now felt impossibly distant. For the first time, he felt the weight of everything that had led him to this moment, the countless conquests, the endless wars, the belief that strength alone could guarantee survival. And now, standing on the precipice of change, he realized that his empire had reached the end of its path. A new beginning was required. A partnership, however foreign, was the only way forward. What must we do? Zorak asked, his voice still heavy, but no longer filled with resistance. Webb smiled, the same quiet, confident smile that had first made Zorak doubt his own beliefs. We take the first step. Together. Extra chapter. The Kian Empire had withdrawn. Zorak, Supreme Commander of the Kian fleet, had led his people in what was supposed to be a quick and decisive strike against humanity. Yet, after unimaginable losses and a retreat that was as humiliating as it was unexpected, Zorak found himself standing before the High Council of the Kian, faced with the aftermath of his failure. Despite all his pride, despite the centuries of victory and dominance, Zorak could not ignore the creeping doubt that had been gnawing at him ever since the retreat. The humans were no longer the weak, primitive species they had once believed. They had surpassed every expectation, rewriting the very laws of physics, outsmarting the Kian Empire at every turn. The realization weighed heavily on Zorak, leaving him restless in his quarters, unable to sleep, unable to think clearly. And then, as though the universe itself were intent on making him confront the truth, a new message came through, an encrypted transmission that caught even the High Council by surprise. Commander Zorak, the message began, a voice unlike any Zorak had heard before. It was deep, soothing, yet laden with a sense of hidden power. You've tasted defeat. And yet, your journey has only just begun. Zorak's mind spun as he listened to the message. It was coming from an unknown source, someone beyond even the Kian Empire's vast network of surveillance and communication systems. This voice wasn't human, yet it had the same quality of calmness, of resolve, that had defined Admiral Monroe. Only this voice carried an undeniable threat. The transmission continued, "You believe that humanity is your only concern, Commander Zorak. But the truth is, your race's failure to adapt is far from the greatest danger. You are being watched by something much older than your kind, something much more dangerous. A force that exists outside the reaches of your empire's grasp. And your failure will be their invitation." Zorak's heart skipped a beat. The weight of the words landed heavily on him. A force more dangerous than humanity? Something older? As if on cue, the holographic display in front of Zorak began to flicker. The strange, unknown message shifted, revealing a set of coordinates that were light years away from the Kian homeworld, deep within a void of space that had been previously unexplored by any civilization. The message concluded with a single sentence: "You will find your answers there, if you are brave enough to seek them." The hologram faded. Zorak stood still for a moment, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. His hands shook as he reached for his communication console. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. The High Council was summoned immediately, each member of the Kian's ruling body arriving with their faces carved in stone, their features betraying nothing but the cold indifference of those accustomed to victory. They were silent as Zorak relayed the message. Their eyes flickered with interest, but no one spoke. Finally, it was Vexar, the eldest and most respected member of the council, who broke the silence. "This message is more than a mere threat, Zorak. It is an invitation." He paused, his voice heavy with the gravity of his words. "Perhaps it is time for the Kian Empire to stop hiding behind its might. Perhaps it is time we face whatever lies beyond our understanding." Zorak's frustration boiled over. "You think we should just go to these coordinates? For what purpose? To submit ourselves to whatever force has been watching us?" He threw his hands up in disbelief. "We've seen what humanity can do. You think we should seek out something even more powerful?" Vexar's four eyes regarded Zorak thoughtfully. "You've seen what humanity is capable of. But I wonder, Zorak, what they will do when they learn that they are not the only ones who have been watched." There was a moment of quiet reflection among the council, but soon the decision was made. Despite Zorak's reservations, the Kian Empire had no choice but to heed the warning. It was a risk they would have to take, one that could either spell the end of their empire or provide them with the key to something far more significant. The coordinates led them to a desolate sector of space, where stars were few and far between. The emptiness of the void was stifling, oppressive. The ships traveled in formation, silent and watchful, knowing that they were venturing into unknown territory. Zorak's hands rested heavily on the console as the fleet neared the designated location. Suddenly, a pulse of energy reverberated through the fleet. It was subtle at first, like the faintest vibration in the hulls of the ships. Then, the lights flickered, and the hum of the engines grew louder, as if something unseen was waking up. "Report," Zorak barked, his voice tense. The tactical officer's voice came over the comms, strained. "Commander, we're detecting a massive energy signature, something unlike anything in our database. It's coming from the center of the sector." Zorak's pulse quickened. He had expected something, but not this. "What is it? A ship? A weapon?" "No, Commander," the officer replied. "It's a presence." The fleet slowed as they approached the center of the anomaly. The energy signature was growing, pulsing in waves, like a heartbeat. It didn't take long for Zorak to realize that this wasn't just a force, they were being drawn in, pulled into something far larger and more ancient than any ship or weapon. And then, without warning, the darkness before them shifted. The Kian fleet was pulled into a gravitational field they couldn't escape. The stars around them seemed to bend, curving inward as if the fabric of space itself was folding in on them. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. The ships shuddered, their engines screaming against the pull, but there was no escaping. "What's happening?" Zorak shouted, his voice barely audible as the bridge trembled under the immense pressure. We're being pulled into nothing." "Commander, we're losing control," the tactical officer cried. "This isn't a gravitational anomaly. It's something else entirely." The entire fleet was now locked in this strange gravitational force. It wasn't a black hole, but it felt like it. And in the distance, amid the chaos, something began to take form. A massive structure, or perhaps a presence itself, materialized. It was unlike anything Zorak had ever seen, vast and incomprehensible, stretching across the stars in ways that defied all logic. It moved, and Zorak realized that it wasn't just an object, but a being, alive and waiting. Before Zorak could command any further action, the communication systems flickered to life, a new transmission coming through. But this time, it was not a voice, this was something more, something older. A dark, deep rumble filled the comms, like the voice of the cosmos itself speaking, the words incomprehensible, but the meaning undeniable. Zorak felt a chill run down his spine. This was not just an invitation. This was a reckoning. And the Kian Empire, for the first time in its existence, was not the one in control.